Well, from 63 to 72, the legislature did not have any of its own permanent staff. The governor's office provided all the budget work. The attorney general's office provided bill drafting and those kinds of things.
This is Under the Dome. Today's episode is hosted by NC Insider editor Colin Campbell, and this is his last time hosting the show. Today we'll take a closer look at the history of the North Carolina State Legislative Building.
Welcome to Under the Dome. I'm Colin Campbell, editor of the NC Insider. And this week on our Closer Look episode, we're going to take a closer look at the place where all the action that we normally talk about happens, the Legislative Building. Certainly, if you've been there once or a million times, your first few visits were probably marked by the questions of, how do I get out of here? I'm lost now because it is so difficult to navigate. And then also probably some questions about the architecture. Why do I feel like I'm in a 70s suburban shopping mall? So to sort of get at how we got here and how we ended up with a building like this to house the seats of power in Raleigh, we're joined this week by unofficial legislative history expert Gerry Cohen, who a longtime legislative staff attorney for the building for over about 37 years, retired a few years back, and is still our go-to source in the media for all these types of topics. Gerry, thanks so much for joining us.
Sure.
So to start us off, tell us a little bit how we got the legislative building we have today. Up until obviously the 60s, they were meeting in the old state capitol, which is now more for ceremonial events and school groups. But at some point, they decided they needed a better space, I guess.
Well, through the 1950s, there was a discussion of the legislature having its own legislative building, and the 57 or 59 session passed a bill funding it and setting up a commission to do the construction, site work, etc. And the building opened for the 1963 session. The floor plan was a lot different at the time. Each member just had one office. There was only a handful of legislative assistants. There was like a steno pool, is what they used to call it, of people assisting in that process. The legislature decided in about 1970, sometime in the mid-70s, to build what became the Legislative Office Building, and at first just occupied 3 floors of it. And that building opened the spring of 1981 for the legislature. At that point, the legislative building, a lot of changes made. Members got 2 offices, one for a legislative assistant during session. The basement had originally been just a parking deck. It was gradually added other uses. A cafeteria was added in the early 70s and staff offices. Eventually, the legislature took over the entire legislative office building. That might have been in the maybe early 1990s when other tenants, the Secretary of State was there, State Auditor was there. I think one other division of state government was in the legislative office building. Historically, where the legislative office building was a Norfolk Southern, some rail spurs from they're in a freight warehouse. The legislative building itself was residences. Old maps I found that the House chamber was a Nabisco bakery on that site until the late 50s.
Yeah, so they have a lot of people who are probably displaced from homes and neighborhoods in this corner of Raleigh as it transitioned from residential to this big state government complex that it is today.
Correct. The entire area from Jones Street to Peace Street was residential and commercial houses. Halifax Street ran down the center of it, but eventually the entire thing became state government uses. Sometime about 15 years ago, I was talking to an employee in the House Clerk's office, long since retired by this point, and I asked her how long have you been here? She was probably in her late 80s at that point, and she says, "Oh, I grew up here." And I said, "What do you mean you grew up here?" She said, "Well, my house is where the Senate chamber is now, second floor."
Wow, so literally on top of where she had previously lived.
Yes.
Wow. That's got to be a strange experience to have your house get torn down and then be replaced by your workplace.
Yes, that's right. And also the area where the Museum of History and Natural Sciences was residential and commercial until about the same era.
Yeah. Looking back, I was reading some sort of old history of it, and it sounded like before they built this building, lawmakers, because there's just so little space in the old state capitol, were having to go to meetings all across state government buildings, and often had to miss meetings because they couldn't walk 3 blocks in time to get to another one. And then I guess this building was hailed as, oh, you can do everything under one roof. You can eat lunch. You can go to all your committee meetings. All your offices are there. So I guess that was the sort of selling point of having a standalone legislative building, right?
Yes, North Carolina was the first state to have its own building solely for the General Assembly. Other buildings functions at what's now a senior residence. What was then the Sir Walter Hotel was the hub. Many legislators lived there the entire session in basically a residential hotel. There were meeting rooms there. A lot of the business took place informally in function rooms at the Sir Walter Hotel back prior to the legislative building being built. There was very little space. When the legislative building was originally built, there was not even many committee rooms.
Yeah, and obviously those are still sort of the cramped committee rooms we see today. I was looking back; it looks like those haven't really changed much at all. The horseshoe-shaped table that they sit around in the Rules Committee room seems like it's unchanged since at least the 70s, if not perhaps the original days of the building.
Yeah, that room was the Finance Committee room from 63 to 81, and then the long room on the other side of the building under the Senate chamber was the Appropriations Committee room from 63 to 81.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine the number of people that attend those meetings now getting crammed into the smaller building in the legislative building.
It sure was. It sure was cramped.
Yeah. So what do you know about the history of the architecture there? I know Edward Durrell Stone designed it. Have the complaints that we hear today always sort of been in place about the way it was designed and sort of the odd way it looks compared to a lot of other state legislative buildings in the country?
Well, it was a topic of much discussion. The architecture is pretty uniform in all the quadrants. And when you mentioned earlier about it being lost, especially at night, even when I had worked in the building for 35 years, I would still get lost at night when I didn't have any cues from sunlight. I remember once, 2010 or so, coming out of one of these 14-hour Appropriations Committee meetings, going back to work on the budget. It may have been 11 p.m. and coming to what I thought was the back of the building, but it was the front on Jones Street. And I asked the people at the desk, how long has this desk been here? And I was totally backwards. And I was going out to Jones Street when I thought I was leaving to go across the bridge. And then, of course, there's the bridge tunnel story, which is a different but comparable, but a parallel story.
Yeah, I thought that was sort of interesting the way it's changed. When I looked at the old floor plans, the back entrance, I guess because there was no need to go across out the backside towards the legislative office building because it didn't exist at the time, was actually the members-only dining area. So I guess in the early days, you would have had that visual cue of, hey, which entrance is which. And nowadays, it looks sort of similar if you're headed towards one or the other. I've made the exact same mistake you were talking about of thinking I was going out the front when I was actually in the back of the building. So I gather that changed when the legislative office building was created and you had this whole bridge and passageway situation. What's the backstory to that? Because I understand originally there was talk of a tunnel before the bridge was built.
Well, the legislative office building, when it was built, it was designed to have a tunnel to the legislative building. In fact, until 15 years ago, it sloped down to the sidewalk level under Jones Street. And the story is, I don't think it's just a story because it's a fact, that the proposal was to build a tunnel. It would come out somewhere in the basement of the legislative building to make it easy to go back and forth. It wasn't just members, it was staff, media, etc. The cost was projected back in 82 at $500,000. And there was a series of editorials, I remember it was a series in the News and Observer, decrying the waste of money just to keep people dry. And whether the editorials were right or wrong, it was stinging anyway. And the legislative response was eventually to build a bridge across, which street is that? Was it Lane?
Lane Street, I think is
Lane
the
Street.
backside, yeah.
Build a bridge, which actually cost $1 million, twice as much, because they had to underground all the power lines. And so it actually cost twice as much, and not a peep from our friendly editorial writers. I don't know, was Claude Sitton at the time, or who it exactly was that wrote the editorials. If he was editor, I'm sure he had a hand in it. During the interim in the legislative office building, before the bridge was built and after the tunnel had been scrapped, there were school children and pedestrians who were hit crossing Lane Street, school groups and stuff. There were pedestrian accidents. So eventually the bridge got built, and it's until we became more security conscious, everything was totally open to the public to come in and out of both buildings.
Yeah, and it's I guess history sort of repeats itself in that there's this item that's getting a lot of chatter in the House budget of spending $8 million for some sort of covered pedestrian walkway. I guess the concern being that because you never did the tunnel, people get wet if it's raining and they've got to run between the two buildings. So I guess we'll see how that goes and whether there's sort of a similar outcry over this that changes the budget process going forward, or whether we get some rain protection.
Well, I have not seen the plans for that. I did see that budget item, and I don't know exactly what it would be. I know from having ferried carts of paper back and forth, because we're less paper conscious, that, we get documents wet, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to get into whether or not a covered walkway should be built or exactly what it would be. I know there are some issues, like if there was there and folks could pass through, and once they pass security in one building or the other, then if that was secure, then they could go to the other building without going through security again. So that may be some of the issues, but I'm not going to get myself involved in whether or not that should be built.
Yeah. Looking back at the main legislative building, have there been many changes over time, both in terms of how the chambers are set up, and then just other aspects of that building? It just does feel like it's sort of, in many ways, a time capsule, but I'm sure there have been some improvements or at least redecorating over the years that you worked there.
There were some, I think the Senate chamber, you'd have to Senate clerk's office, I think the Senate chamber had a major overhaul and redoing maybe 2010, and the House chamber sometime in the last 5 years or so. When the first building was open, there were pneumatic tubes to carry. The press was actually in the gallery in the House chamber, and there were pneumatic tubes the first several years, I'm told, where copies of bills would be ferried up to the press through a pneumatic tube from the clerk's office. When I started working in 1977, the tubes were still there, but they were not functional. There was no compressed air for them anymore, and I think the tubes may have remained there another 15 or 20 years, but non-functional, because eventually the press was allowed on the floor and the need vanished.
Oh yeah, there's a sergeant at arms could pass things out, and nowadays we have the dashboard system that anybody can keep up with what's going on the floor as far as amendments. What sort of changes have you seen in terms of staffing levels over the time you've been there? Because obviously it seems like when the legislative building was created, you didn't really get much in the way of staff, and now it just seems like everybody at least has a legislative assistant, but there are all these sort of back end staff folks that keep the place running in ways that when they had a much smaller space, I don't think any of those folks were in existence in terms of those positions.
Well, from 1963 to 1972. The legislature did not have any of its own permanent staff. The budget bureau was called, and the governor's office provided all the budget work. The attorney general's office provided bill drafting, and those kinds of things. In 72, I think the Fiscal Research Division was created. In 74, the Research, now Legislative Analysis Division, was created. And in 77, the Bill Drafting Division was created. North Carolina was the last state to have its own bill drafting. When that was started in the 77 session, that's when I was hired. And the first crop of people, then there are other divisions added and unadded, like performance evaluation. There's been a gradual growth of what we called at the time, there's synonyms, partisan staff, leadership staff. There's been different words, and that's gradually grown over time as well.
Yeah, I noticed just looking at the old floor plans, the Speaker's office, and I guess at the time it would have just been the Senate President, since that was who the power player was on the Senate side before the Lieutenant Governor's powers got shifted. And their offices were only marginally larger than the offices of the rank and file members. And now, of course, there's entire corners of the building that are taken up by the various staff folks for the corner offices, as they're known.
Yeah, that happened when the Legislative Office Building opened in 81, and then the leadership got basically suites of offices as offices opened for about half or a little bit more than half of the members in the Legislative Office Building.
Okay. So that was just a function of having extra space for everybody, and leadership took up a little bit more than everybody else was getting.
And there's actually one person who, Representative Becky Carney from Mecklenburg, who's in the legislature quite a while. She's a Raleigh native, and she worked on the legislative staff in the 65 or 67 session as a bill typist and proofreader. So she'd be a very good person to talk to about what it was like then, during that era, after the legislative building opened, but before a lot of major expanses. She has lots of fun stories. And she eventually moved to Charlotte.
Yeah. Has the same period seen a lot of changes in sort of session length? I noticed it looks like only it's been since the 70s that we've had a short session. In the even years, it used to be that the odd year long session was pretty much it for every 2 years.
Well, up until 1960, 67 or so, members per diem was limited to a certain number of days. And I didn't really start hanging around until 71, but the stories were at the time from people there is that once that number of days ran out, there was a lot of pressure from rank and file members to leadership to end the session. And at the time also, the Constitution only allowed the legislature to adjourn one day without a joint resolution. So there were Saturday sessions through 1969, pro forma Saturday sessions to meet the constitutional requirement. There were regular Friday sessions in the Senate until around 91, and in the House till sometime later in the 90s. There were regular working sessions on Fridays. And now we've gone normally to the pattern of adjourn on Thursday over to Monday. But the Constitution was amended in 1970 to allow adjournment for up to 3 days.
Okay, so that sort of shifted a lot of the sort of a more leisurely pace, I guess, but for much longer stretches of time than we saw in the past. I was also sort of curious if the not being as cramped, you could had less of a pressure to get into town and out of town quickly. Just because you wanted to get back to your spacious home office in whatever district you're in, rather than be cramped in some tiny little closet in the legislative building somewhere.
Right. 1974 was the first what we call short session. It wasn't called that then because in 74 it wasn't short at all. Although it didn't start till April, it ran several months, and it wasn't until the 76 session that it became short, because there was a lot of pushback from members that they had not expected in 1974 to be there for months.
Yeah, and now that's sort of the norm in both years, is that we get to August and September, and no one really has a good sense for when the long session will end, or whether there'll be another session for redistricting later on, and so on and so on. It feels like it doesn't necessarily have a definitive end anymore, and I guess a lot of that has changed just in the last 40 or 50 years.
Yeah, I mean, when I first came to the legislature, it was a special session in October of 71, when I was in grad school at Chapel Hill, I came over to work on a piece of legislation on absentee voting. And here it is 50 years later, and I'm still working on it.
Yeah, the topics don't seem to change that much. If you look back at old legislation, we're still grappling with a lot of the same issues. And it sounds like over your many decades of your career, it's the same thing. The issues didn't really go away that you started out with, that you finished up on, and still are called on to talk about to media and others. All right. Well, I think that covers the time we've got for this week's edition. Gerry Cohen is a longtime legislative attorney, now retired, and sort of our resident expert on all things General Assembly. Gerry, thanks so much for joining us.
Sure. Thanks, Colin.
For more from our politics team, subscribe to the News and Observer at newsobserver.com/subscribe. Follow us on Twitter at Under the Dome and NC Insider, and sign up for our weekly political newsletter at newsobserver.com/newsletters. Thanks for listening.